Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and it is the week after elections. And as I think we've done probably for about a decade now, my guest is Luther Weeks from Connecticut Voters Count, who also, I think, initiated the Citizens Election Audit Observation Program. And so now that we've cast our votes, we know the results, we're going to talk about election integrity, how we can be even surer in the future than we are today that our votes are counted and counted right. So thanks for coming down to New London again, Luther.
Okay, I want to say we got to stop meeting this way. We only get together after an election.
I know. Well, you did come a couple times to talk about the humanist and the anti-religious oaths, and I'll tell you.
We're not anti-religious.
We're inclusive oaths.
Yeah.
And I have noticed that I'm seeing more of those lately. So that's a good thing. But so you can come up for other reasons too. But the election is still on people's minds, and nothing really controversial happened in New London this time around. But, the integrity of our elections is still a big deal. So I guess maybe start out by talking about, why it's so important that we know that our votes really count.
Sure. So, it's very important for democracy that citizens have confidence in our democracy. And a big part of confidence in our democracy is they have confidence in our elections. Now, sometimes officials say that, one of their overriding goals is the public have confidence in our elections, but I like to say justified confidence, because if your only interest were confidence, then you kind of deny any chance of error or anything like that. I want justified confidence, justified integrity in our elections.
So, I got my postcard in the mail reminding me that it's time to sign up to observe an audit. I haven't yet, but I plan to, because it's always been a great experience. And before we talk about the details, maybe this time start out a little bit about what the post-election audit is, what the role of observers is, and
Sure.
the process to get involved.
Sure. Part of having justified confidence in elections is that they're transparent, and the public can convince themselves of the accuracy of the elections. They don't have to trust in a particular person. You don't have to trust in a machine, for sure. And so one of the things Connecticut does is 5% of the polling places in every election, they recount between 1 and 3 races in each of those across the state to supposedly assure the accuracy of our voting machines. And, without our observers, no one would know what happens in those audits except for a few local officials would know what happened in their town. But what we do is we organize voters to go watch those and observe what's happened in those. And we independently report to the state and the voters of the state and to the state legislature how those audits were conducted and what the results were. And our results are quite different than the results reported by the state. The state reports that everything's fine, now go away, and the machines are almost perfect. And we don't report that way.
Well, have you found a difference? It seems like the first couple, even for the first several years, I observed them. And if it was the first time a municipality had done it, they really felt very not confident of their own methods
Right.
to begin with.
And they used methods that weren't all that good. The problem is that happens over and over because, especially now that we only do 5%, it used to be 10%. I say a registrar's first audit may be their last, because by the time they get selected again, they might need to be registrars again. And so it's somebody else, new to the process and not aware of it. So, by the way, I'm going to encourage your audience to sign up for the audits and being part of this because people learn a lot from being part of what we do. We have online video training and all that. And you go to ctelectionaudit.org. This is the last week that you can sign up for the audits that occur because they start next Wednesday. Our training starts Friday. Our training is done on Tuesday. Then for a couple of weeks, we're going to be doing the work of the audit. So I'd like your friends and everybody watching to sign up for it. You only have to volunteer one day, but we want you to give us several possible days that you can volunteer because we got to match you up with an audit that occurs someplace near where you live.
Right, and if someone from New London wants to sign up and put down the same days as I do, perhaps someone who's never done it before would be welcome to come along.
Yeah.
Because the first time I recall, you're never sent alone.
Right. Yeah. Because after you see it the first time, you understand it a lot better. Do the training a second time, and then you're a pro. It really it sounds intimidating the first time, but after that, you'll realize things go at a slow pace. And you'll understand them the second time you go out. But you got to go that first time. And many of our observers have gone on and become election officials.
Well, it's funny because on Election Day, we had a few of the Democratic candidates were also cross-endorsed by the Working Families Party.
Yeah.
And when I was at the polls, just during Election Day, someone started to ask me a question about, I don't know, the voting, and they said, "No, you don't want to get involved in this question." And he said, "How do they?" And I said, "Sure, I do, of course." He said, "Well, how do they count the votes if people are on two lines, and what happens if someone votes for you twice?"
Right.
And I said, "I knew the answer," and I actually in my phone had a picture of a tape from one of these audits that said, showed the four numbers, the two from each party, and then the unknown number and the total number.
Sure.
And they were really impressed. And it's like, well, if you go to enough of these, you're just going to see it.
Yeah, and we train people in that. We have frequently asked questions that cover that. Our observers know more about it than the average election official doing the audit.
And I'll tell you, the election officials know that, and sometimes it makes them a little nervous, I must say. I personally try not to be intimidating, but you also sometimes are in the situation where they kind of want advice, which we really can't give them. It's like their audit.
Right.
But I think as once you observe several times, it teaches you a lot about the system, and about why we have audits and what the purpose is, because I sometimes found that people don't really understand even exactly what the purpose is.
Right.
You said you were at a recanvass today in Glastonbury.
Right.
And I think in a recanvass, ballots are looked at because voter intent is quite important.
In a very close race, that's right.
But the audits are really to test the machine. They're not to figure out whether the person who put a circle around, nowhere near the bubble, who they wanted to vote for. It's to test how the machine is doing things. And sometimes you see funny ballots that
Yeah.
You know,
1 out of every 3,000 ballots is funny, but you'd think the way officials talk, that's half the ballots or something sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's it's small, especially after we've used the lever machines for, I guess, 11 years now, 12 years.
Yeah.
The voters are smarter. They're used to it. They're used to them, and the officials are smart too.
Yeah, I think people know how to vote better than they used to, but I do remember seeing one ballot one year that there were two candidates, or maybe it was a referendum even, and the person had put filled in one bubble, like the yes bubble, then put an X through it, and then put yes next to the second bubble with now really filling it in.
Right.
Like, what do they want to do? I don't.
Yeah, 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 2 or
Not
3,000.
very
Yeah,
often.
not very often. Yeah, I mean, it happens in every election, but it's not very many ballots.
No, it might be 2 or 3 that are funny, and
Yeah.
I think voters have gotten better at the system
Right.
as they've used it. Now I think, yeah, it's been a decade. I think 2000.
Well, 2007, the first statewide use, and yeah, so that's 12. This is 13th election we just had.
Yeah.
13th in November, plus a few primaries along the way.
Yeah, so people are learning about it, although, I still would like to see a little bit different ballot design in this state.
Absolutely.
I know some of our friends in Willimantic were telling us how confused voters were about how to vote. I think it was even more confusing than New London because they have some minority seats and some people can only vote for so many from each party, and I don't know.
Yeah, there is something. There's a completely different format of ballot than our ballot. It was designed the way the lever machines looked, and
Yeah.
I believe it's only New York State and Connecticut
I
that
think
have
so
those.
too.
New York's are even worse because they have to put New York City, they have to put about 5 different languages in there, like Chinese and everything else, and there's hardly any room for a bubble left in it.
And I remember in the gubernatorial race, I don't know if it was the last one or the one before, Governor Cuomo was on the Democratic Party line and the Working Families Party line, and 2 other parties that were just kind of made up for the election, I guess. And his name was on 4 times, and the Republicans' name was on 3 or 4 times, and there were a couple other independent or minor party candidates. I mean, it was, I think on some counties, I don't know if it's by the candidates were on 2 different lines. It was very confusing.
Yeah.
So maybe I've been
Connecticut
trying.
and New York, we both are a little strange in that way.
Yeah.
And there's people that study this, and they know how to make ballots better. Even our ballots, they still look like a lever machine, but they could be done better.
They could be.
Yeah.
And personally, being not a party line voter at all, I get really tired of people saying you should just vote line A or just vote line B.
Yeah.
For one thing, as good as a party is, their vetting process is not going to be perfect, as the Democrats in New London discovered this year.
Yeah.
And you always want the voters to do independent research about the
Right.
candidates.
Right.
So I guess I want to talk about like the machines. One of the questions is that it's getting near time to replace the first generation of machines, or coming up. Is that true in Connecticut, or is it other states that are
first
doing
of all,
that more?
if you look back to the 1800s or something, this is not the first generation of voting machine we've had.
Oh, that's
and
true.
we had lever machines, and we had, but so one of the things that we do in our audit is we actually ask questions of the election officials. And so one of the questions we ask is, did you have any problems with your voting machines on election day? And 2 years ago, I thought maybe our machines were getting a little old because we were starting to have more problems. But those problems went away. And as far as I know, we are the only ones that provide reliable evidence of what's going on out there. And my evaluation is our machines are still working fine. Doesn't mean you can't get anecdotal evidence, but right from day one, machine doesn't work once in a while. One in my polling place didn't work this time when we started it up. It was the only one in our whole town that didn't work. And we have, we got quite a few voting machines around town. So for now, our machines are working fine, but we will have to replace them sometime in the next 5 to 10 years.
Now, there isn't any talk, or I'm hoping there isn't any talk of switching away from our voter filled out paper ballots
I
in the
hope
process.
not, but there's a huge national controversy right now because we know that DRE,
Yeah.
direct record, like that's where you do a touch screen and there's no paper record whatsoever, is bad, a no-no.
Yeah.
But the problem is those are being replaced by something called a BMD, which is a ballot marking device. So it's a touch screen
Okay.
that you vote on, and then it prints out a piece of paper, and you can check that piece of paper, and then you can go over and scan that piece of paper in. So there is a record that you can audit, but there are several problems with ballot marking devices. First of all, as a voter, the average voter does not verify their vote. Okay? There's some studies that say 10%. There's some other anecdotal evidence that say almost no voters verify that.
Wow.
The second thing is there's a lot of voters that are not well informed, and that's not necessarily their fault. But they go in there and they're not quite sure. They didn't know that half the candidates, they'd never heard of their names, they don't know the difference. So they hem and haw and they vote a certain way. They don't necessarily know 30 seconds later what their final decision was because they hemmed and hawed
Right.
so much. And then if they go and try and tell you as an election official that the machine didn't do it right and they let them re-vote it, but the chances are if I, let's say, take 10% of the ballots and I switch them
Yeah.
to my candidate. When you voted for the other candidate, I switch them to my candidate. And if only 10% of the people are checking it, 1 out of 10 will go and re-vote it the other way. The rest of them, I've stolen 9% of the
Wow.
votes for my candidate. And, an insidious attacker could actually figure out which voters were hemming and hawing, which one's taking a long time, and so could pick and choose who to do. So not a good idea. The other thing is
Now, that is used right now for voters who are vision impaired or
right, and that's good to have one of those
for
machines
an
for those
adaptive use.
Right, and the people, some advocates for the people with disabilities, some argue that if we all had to vote with the same machine, then we would make better machines for the disabled. I would argue better to work on making better machines for the disabled and getting those. The other good and bad part of this machine is they cost 2, 3, 4 times as much as the optical scanners that we have. They may last a little less time too. So it's very bad. That's bad. It costs us a lot more money, but it's good for the manufacturers of those machines who spend a lot of money lobbying election officials. So we've just bought a bunch of those in Pennsylvania. They're buying those in Georgia. There's lawsuits in both cases against that because of the mechanism they were used to purchase them. And also there's, people really feel that they're much more dangerous than the other ones, and they are. But it's a huge issue right now. So, if we're looking for new machines in Connecticut, my first advice to the Secretary of State and whoever else is making that decision is stay with voter-marked, optical scan, paper ballot elections. That's the number one advice to them. I got other kinds of advice to them also, but we'll start to that. Connecticut make a huge mistake to go away from that. I don't think we will. I think we're used to we're used to optical scan paper ballots. I'm hopeful that we would never make that mistake. It's easier for these companies to go into states that are used to the DRE and then sell them the BMT.
Yeah.
So I hope we avoid that, not just from the expense, but what's the best way to do the election. Unfortunately, it's very sad that Pennsylvania and Georgia and some other states are going the wrong way. They're spending too much money doing the wrong thing.
And Pennsylvania has been controversial in the past. So, are
Right.
they going from the pan into the fire now, or
Well,
is this still?
they're wasting a lot of money for a quarter of a step forward. They're wasting a lot of money for a quarter of a step forward. All the experts told them to do otherwise. All their experts told them that. But then the Board of Elections made the wrong decision, and I don't know, it's called the Board of Elections, but Philadelphia and a whole bunch of areas like that, did that wrong thing. The whole state of Georgia is doing the wrong thing. It's really disappointing.
I know there was a conversation about this in Connecticut 15, 16 years ago that, that optical scan was originally not the first choice.
That's right.
In this state.
That's right.
And
There was a big
we almost made
a mistake, and I think we've learned a lot in those last years too. I mean, if you were to ask the same technical people 10 years ago, they would have probably been fine with BMDs. So some officials that have bought them, think they got advice from very technical people that it was okay a few years ago. But the thinking on it has completely changed in the last few years because people have done the research and they've realized that there's a lot of problems with the BMD that they didn't really originally anticipate. And I'm not sure how much of the argument by the advocates for the people with disabilities is a real argument, or it's front groups, or very highly financed by the voting machine industry.
Right, the ones who want to sell those machines.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, I usually go and observe the testing of the memory cards, partly because I want to see it, but partly because I think our registrars shouldn't just toil in obscurity. I think some people should recognize that a lot of work goes into getting these tabulators put together and tested and secured.
Right.
And they should know. People should know what goes into it.
Yeah.
And a couple of years ago, it seems to me that the ballots they were feeding in, one year they decided to mark them using the BMD device machine, and they're not doing that anymore. The ones they're feeding in are all hand marked.
I'm glad to hear that.
I was glad to see that.
Yeah, there's problems. There's actually two problems that are related, because it was sort of a program that was printing out those ballots from the BMD. So first of all, that wasn't testing the BMD. The way to test the BMD is to have a few people use the interface for the disabled. I doubt they're even doing that.
Right.
But that tested the BMD. But the other thing is that those don't mark it exactly the way a voter does. They over cover.
Yeah, it was almost the whole corner of the square.
They cover. Yeah, well, I think they've reduced that, but they cover the oval much bigger than the oval. Now, that's a good idea for the purpose of the BMD, but it's not a good idea of testing whether the machine actually is aligned to the right place for that oval. If the machine was misaligned a little bit from where the oval was, or the oval wasn't printed in quite the right place, you wouldn't actually be testing that in that way.
Yeah, so that was a very short-lived experiment.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
So I'm glad. So you talked a little about the audits. Is there anything that could be done better with how Connecticut conducts its audits right now?
Sure. First, it could be done more rigorously. The Secretary of State could make sure that when they submit the results of the audit, the Secretary of State simply looks at the form that they're required to submit at the end of the audit and make sure the form is completed completely and accurately. Accurately meaning that they filled in what they need to fill in and it makes sense. And also they can make sure that everybody that's supposed to do an audit actually completes a form and gives it to the Secretary of State, and some of them do not. I find that interesting that the Secretary of State office doesn't take the interest in that. And they're supposed to do a report after every election on the audit. UConn is supposed to do that. And in their wisdom, the legislature didn't give them a date to finish that. So we've had reports from 2011 onward that have yet to be completed. We had a presidential election in 2012, and we haven't seen an audit report. And then, of course, I only checked 3 months ago. You know, they could have done it since then, but we're still awaiting the report from the 2012 election. And if you know the president we elected then, even the U.S. senator we elected them, it completed their terms.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot. Now the audit themselves could be stiffened up in a variety of ways. And there's, what we're calling, we use the wrong name, this should be called post-election tabulation audits. Okay, because that's all they audit. We should be auditing other things. We should be auditing the security of the ballots, how well the ballots are secured. How can we trust that the ballots in the audit or in a recanvass are the ballots voted in the election? Connecticut has one of the poorest levels of ballot security that I know of. I'm sure you might find a state that was worse, but I don't know of any. So we should audit that. We should audit our absentee ballots and our absentee ballot applications. We should audit our check-in lists. We should audit how our towns do at comparing the number of people checked in to the number of ballots cast, because they make mistakes in that all the time, huge mistakes. And it's mostly a mistake made by a person in accounting for the ballots, but they don't catch that, which they should.
Well, that's what happened, in 2011 when we had our Riverside Park referendum, and there were about 40 more votes than ballots cast, and it turned out that a certain subset of the absentee ballots for which there was a write-in candidate for mayor, and when people hand counted, their votes for that mayoral candidate, they actually recalculated all the races. So those the rest of the ballots were all double counted.
Right.
And that was fortunately discovered. Fortunately, it was within that 0.5%. It was off by 19 votes, I believe.
Okay.
So there was a mandatory recanvass, and it turned out, or it was 13 votes, and it turned out it was 19 in the other direction.
Yeah, and that problem was that a sleepy moderator read the write-in ballots through the machine twice. But the record, by the way, is 151 that we know of.
Wow.
And, what bothers me is that was discovered in an audit. But there should have been 3 or 4 checks that occurred within a week of the election. Nobody should have discovered that 3 weeks later in an audit, that they had a count of 151 more ballots counted than they had ballots checked off. That's not supposed to happen. And but it did, and it's surprising. And
I know election night is busy, and everyone wants the results as fast as they can get them, and I've been no exception. But that one night that happened, the person who was observing that count and getting the numbers was muttering something about 39 votes or something not right. So even that night, they didn't match up.
Even with
the number of
even
votes
if that
with the
person
number of
wasn't there,
ballots.
the moderator of ABs should have discovered it. But I could see them sleeping through it. But then it goes to the town hall where the head moderator should have discovered it. Then the next day, the registrar should have discovered it. And then within a week, when it was supposed to be certified by the town clerk should have discovered it. So all those checks, and believe me, the 151 wasn't the only. There was 50 here. In one case, I showed up at the audit, and they said there was one ballot read in twice. Well, that could have been, I'm surprised that they found it. That's a credit to that town that they found it and realized it. But 50 or 150.
that can have a huge impact on results.
Right, it can.
There are a lot of races that are decided by fewer than 30 or 40 votes, not
Right.
to mention
Right.
15 or 20.
Right, and it could be the difference between, if you got a recanvass, you'd probably catch it, but you can make the error so that there is no recanvass. And on the other side, you can make an error and cause a recanvass when there didn't need to be one. That's an expensive process.
It is. So, so what else could be done to make our audit process better?
Well, in the long run, we could have, first of all, we don't audit any hand-counted ballots. We don't audit the count of the ballots in the central count AB. So, we need to have every ballot subject to selection for audit. That doesn't mean we need to audit every ballot.
Sure.
But we shouldn't be auditing just our machines. We should be auditing our election results. So that's another thing. The election results are reported to the Secretary of State in an electronic system. I think it's a very good system, very good way to do it. But that's not audited. Okay, and the Secretary of State's office, even though they keep promising it to me, does not give us the data from their system to allow us to audit the results on the Secretary of State's website in a way that makes sense. They keep promising. I'm hoping they provide us with that. It's a very small change to the system, just another report giving us all the data that they take in.
Now, having gone to, and observed some, a lot of audits, recently there's been the option given to some towns to bring their ballots to a centralized place and view ballot images while the audit is done.
Yeah.
Not through hand counting.
Yeah. So I'm a big supporter of, that method in general of how to audit. However, they don't do it well. Once again, they don't do it well. The answer is there's a way to randomly select ballots that are audited that way and check that they were accurately audited by just looking at a few of them. But they don't do that. What they do is they look at this image on the screen, which is in many ways useless. It's theater. Okay. So first of all, you don't know if that image actually represents the ballot. They're unable to see if the ballot was counted right. There's a theater that says they do, but they aren't. And it's very simple. It would save less. It would be done with less work and less time, in almost the same way. But they wouldn't have to look at every image on the screen, and they could check some of the paper against the machine. And that machine it was developed by UConn, cost Connecticut a little bit of money. We put some money into it. But we're not exploiting it fully, and we're not exploiting it in the right way. And that machine pretty much has the capability to do it the right way, but it's not being done the right way.
Okay. Now, to sort of shift gears a little, this past election season, Bridgeport was much in the news.
Yeah.
And it seemed like, the problems, transcended one problem. There were a lot of things that were done in such a way as to not inspire confidence in their voting system. So what did they do wrong? And then we can talk about how could it be made right?
So based on an investigation by the Connecticut Post, they found lots of instances in several different ways where people were coerced, or they didn't really vote. They didn't really want an absentee ballot, or they didn't take the initiative, and somebody voted it for them, and other stuff. There were many violations of the law, in my opinion. From all I know is what I've read in the Connecticut Post. I didn't, So there are many violations of the law. So and it brings in the United States has a very poor history of handling close or very questionable elections. And, nobody wants, if there's a couple of little violations, nobody wants to overturn an election where somebody won it by a significant margin. The problem is that Bridgeport's in that quasi thing where, you don't know if illegal absentee ballot operations was the cause of a different candidate winning. Okay, there's a tradition in Bridgeport of the Democratic Party working very, very hard to get a lot of absentee ballots for their candidates. Well, some of that is legal, and some of it's not legal. And the question is, did they do so much that the election went the wrong way? And irregardless of that, did they do enough that questions the election enough that, besides, punishment, that part of the punishment is to do the election over again and have it monitored and all that. And, that's a judgment question. I can't answer that, but I do believe that one key is to enforce the current law against every case you can possibly, and any person that was a perpetrator on that they should be punished. Whether it's a fine or as they've done in the past, is like, in addition to that, you are disallowed for 3 years or 5 years from touching an absentee ballot or absentee, you individually and that kind of stuff. And I think we need to step up election enforcement. Our watchdogs like freedom of information, ethics, and especially elections enforcement has been crippled. This is a bipartisan operation to, and I don't want to say nonpartisan either. I'm going to say bipartisan operation to kill our watchdog agencies or cripple our watchdog agencies. And their load goes up and up and up, and their capabilities go down and down and down. We got to step up enforcement. We got to, let people know that there's a good chance that they're going to get caught. And if they do get caught, they're going to get penalties. And it's going to be swifter than, they're too slow because they got too big a workload. I think we should audit our absentee ballot applications, and we should audit our absentee ballots. So that means looking at them randomly to see if the paperwork is right. It may mean contacting randomly some of the voters and saying, did you request an absentee ballot, blah, 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 blah. It's a situational thing too, it's who you can contact and who you can't. But I think that ought to be done. I think it ought to be more heavily done where there's been a history of problems. So you might say, we're going to pick half of them randomly throughout the state, and then we're going to take the towns that have had problems in the past, and we're going to take the other half out of them. Right. So, your Bridgeport, your Hartford, your Stamford, where you have a history of this, you're going to hit them harder, and there's going to be, some enforcement on it. I think that's the solution. I've heard of a lot of crazy solutions, expanding there's a lot of people that are in favor of no excuse absentee voting.
I was going to ask you that next.
But that's not going to. Now, there might be reasons to be in favor of that, but that's not a solution to the problem we had in Bridgeport. That makes it worse. It dilutes the bad ones, so they're harder to find. And it makes more opportunities for corruption and that stuff. So that's not a solution for this. There was a move last year that didn't succeed in the legislature to allow you to apply for an absentee ballot online. Sounds real good, but how do they catch the absentee ballot fraud? After the fact, you find the same person signed for 10 applications in paper, and the same person signed the envelopes that went in and stuff. So if you take away a thing that requires a human signature, then you're taking away one of the ways that we try and, that we can approve absentee ballot fraud. So those are not the solutions. The solutions are what I said: increase enforcement, and do some auditing of the absentee ballot process.
Now you mentioned, we know that one issue and big picture of voting access is. And I don't think Connecticut is the worst offender, but disenfranchisement of voters, like places where there might not be adequate polling places in some neighborhoods, and that expanding absentee voting is one way that people suggest to remedy that. But with all the problems with absentee ballots, I tend to agree with you that that's not the answer.
Right.
How can we safely make it possible that everyone who wants to vote can get to the polls?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the laws we have are absentee ballot, cover people that are out of state on election day or out of town all day on election day. They very well cover people that are disabled or sick or whatever. So in that regard, I don't think we need to change anything. I would be in favor of a compromise, what I call is in-person absentee balloting. And that's where you can go to town hall and you can vote your absentee ballot and you turn it right in right there. You apply for it and you take. So the person that works in New York City, that I wasn't quite sure whether they're going to get back in time, if they live in Fairfield County or something. Or, it's a pain in the butt to get back in time.
Right.
And they have to leave early and all that. Sure. Well, then they can, and then they have this, so you have to have one weekend day that you can do this. You have to have like a Thursday night that you're open,
Sometimes it isn't regular, work hours.
Yeah, something like that, but a limited amount. That's what I'd be in favor of, and say anybody can do that. Anybody can vote that way. That's me as a compromise on that. You lose something by doing absentee balloting because you go to an optical scanner, it will kick your vote out if you double voted by mistake.
Right.
So if you go absentee voting and you make a mistake and double vote or overvote, you vote for 7 candidates when you can only vote for 6, your vote will never be counted. And you don't know that in absentee ballot. So, and studies have shown that absentee balloting doesn't increase turnout, it lowers turnout. People don't believe that, it's counterintuitive, but that's what the studies show. So you're providing convenience for people who would have voted anyway.
Now, at the same time, I know you've advocated for people overseas, like the military, to be assured of having their votes counted, and they're often not. Mm-hmm. So how can we make sure that our citizens who are abroad on election day can get their votes in time?
Okay, so there's two groups of people we're talking about, is military and overseas voters. And they're two different groups. And first of all, the last study that the government made, which is that I've heard of several years ago, said that the military votes at the same level as all the rest of the citizens in the country if you take into account their age. Okay.
How interesting.
Yeah, so...
You'd think they'd have a big stake in it, though.
Yeah, they would. They do. Well, they do. Well, on the other hand, if you look at the military is skewed to a younger voter who probably is not college educated. And those are the same voters that don't tend to vote, for a variety of reasons, don't tend to vote very much anyway. And they're overseas, and they're kind of, many of them, disconnected from local politics and in some cases from national politics. But they do vote the same ratios, their demographics. So I think it's a myth that they don't vote and their votes aren't counted. On the other hand, there are some challenges. The government's done some things, but they don't do enough. There's some responsibility on the military that they help facilitate the soldiers voting. You can't put it all on 50 states and the local registrar. The military is supposed to do some things about it, and they don't. I was in the Army, and my stepfather died while I was in the Army, and I was over in Korea. Not the Korean War, but I was over in Korea. 1/2 hour later, and this was the old age of the dial telephone, 1/2 hour later, I knew that my stepfather had died. They had given me a 30-day leave, and within 2 hours, I was in a Jeep, going to an airport, flying home for that leave. If they can do that, then they can do some help in facilitating me voting.
So I know that. I strongly suspect that you are not a fan of either mail-in or internet voting. Is there a way? I have relatives in Oregon who all the voting is mail-in.
Sure.
What are the risks in your opinion, and how could it be done, can it be
so
done in a secure way?
I'm absolutely against internet voting. Okay, any form of online internet voting. Okay, I'm not completely against mail-in voting. I like what we have in Connecticut. Excuse mail-in voting. Obviously, our military. I'm highly in favor of it for as few votes as possible, but where that's the only option, I'm in favor of it. Oregon, I don't necessarily agree with Oregon that there's been no problems. They just don't, we haven't seen them, we don't know. But I'll tell you what, in Connecticut, we justified our citizens election program based on the fact of a history of campaign finance violations. Well, I think we could justify not expanding absentee voting in Connecticut because of a history of absentee ballot fraud over and over in Hartford and Bridgeport, okay, here and there in other towns. In Stamford, you got a former party chair under federal indictment for it, and the town clerk would be, the other party would be under indictment for it too if she hadn't turned state evidence, from my understanding. So we've got a history of not absentee voter fraud, but absentee voting fraud, systematic by candidates, parties, other people. So we've got to fight back against that, and we got to be very cautious of expanding it. Maybe Oregon's got good things. Maybe they don't need public financing elections because everything's been going fine.
Yeah.
That's not true in Connecticut.
Now, the Connecticut, I guess I don't want to exactly call it the voting bureaucracy, but the Register of Voters system, the bipartisan system that every town has a Republican and a Democratic registrar.
Yeah.
Is that an antiquated system? Do we need to make things less partisan and more professional? And if yes, what would that look like?
Well, I would say I'd like to see a regional voting system. So you have regional election offices, each office big enough to have 5 or 6 full-time employees. Get it out of individual towns. But if you have 5 or 6 full-time employees, you'd have a career path. You could make it into a civil service. I say do for elections what we've done for probate. We regionalized probate, we professionalized probate, we took it out of the individual towns. Something similar to that. That's what I'd like to see. Secretary of State said she's in favor of, professionalizing it, have a hired single registrar in each town. I'm against that. I think she's got half the right idea, but it's just not if it's under the control of a single town council, it's just as partisan as it is now. So I don't think that's the answer. I think regionalization is the answer. We spend much less on elections than other states per capita, and maybe we get a lot more than we pay for, but unfortunately we should be paying a little bit more, and we should be, we could be doing better.
Now there is a position through the COGS, right, of regional election
monitors.
What do they do, and would they have a part in this future system?
Well, the problem is the regional monitors. It sounds like a good idea, but they pay them about $10,000 a year.
Oh,
and to be done well, it's a full-time job. In fact, there aren't enough of them. It's sort of a good idea. In fact, I think there's 8 of them. One's been open for years. They have never filled it. And I think 6 or 7 of those used to be observers for me. My loss, but the state's gain. And they do a very conscientious job in helping the registrars, especially a couple of them. But I don't think that's the solution. I think they got the right idea. I don't know that I would go with 8 regions. I might go with 20 regions, but my goal would be each region would be big enough to have 5 or 6 full-time, so you'd have a real career path. You could have people specialize in the different areas that a registrar needs to know. But no system is perfect. No system is perfect, but I think we could do better.
Well, it seems to me archaic, being like not a Democrat and not a Republican, that have just the idea of a bipartisan system it's still party oriented and voting, in the state where 40% of the voters are unaffiliated or
Right. Well, it's also the same, people talk about, that there's really the business party, not the Republicans and the Democrats. And to some extent that's true. Well, there's also the insiders and the outsider party. So not everybody in town hall disagrees. Not everybody in the Republican or Democratic Party disagree. A lot of times they want the budget resolution to pass when some of the citizens don't want it to pass, and so that that's the problem, that with it as well.
Now, if there were a single thing you could recommend to help, make voting, confidence in our voting system better, not just in Connecticut, because I think that although we have our problems compared to some other states, our problems are very small.
Yeah.
But, we have a big national election coming up next year.
Sure.
That's very high stakes, and we're seeing the consequences.
You mean who we elect as president makes a difference?
Yeah, or who we select, perhaps, because the gerrymandering that's happened over the last 20 years, a massive voter disenfranchisement in some states. I'm hearing that.
So
what can we do?
Well, so it's not one solution, but first of all, of course, I'd love to see us have voter verified paper ballots everywhere, and really hand marked paper ballots, except maybe that one machine for the people with disabilities. But really, to solve the problem, you need a national equality in franchise. So, in other words, if you're going to let felons vote in Connecticut, they should be able to vote everywhere. If you're going to have same-day registration in Connecticut, it should be true everywhere. If you're going to require a certain form of ID in Connecticut, it should be true everywhere. We need uniform laws, but we also need uniform enforceability, and they got to be enforceable, and they actually ought to be enforced. So they're different things.
What a concept.
So that's a start of it, to make the franchise equal, but federalize our elections, okay? And that's, like I say, with there's no perfect system, but that's one thing. Gerrymandering, once again, that's a huge change, but you got to mandate it federally. And how do you do it in a fair way? That's the problem. How do you do, and that's mainly a problem. Well, it's a problem in state legislators and a problem in the U.S. Congress. Outside of that, that's where gerrymandering applies. You look at a Republican state, and it looks gerrymandered in a Republican way. You look at a Democratic state, I happen to be thinking of one, but if you look at it, you got to say it's gerrymandered in a Democratic way.
So why can't we should give the jobs to the map makers or something, not
like,
to the politicians?
Something like that, or we do some kind of binding arbitration, and it's sort of like this last best offer they use with school systems. The Democrats come up with one offer, the Republicans come, and the arbitrator picks between which is the fairest. That I don't know the full answer to that. The big reform I wish we had was proportional voting. And, I'm not sure exactly how that works, but they have it in Europe, whether they did it state by state or nationally. I really think that proportional voting makes a much more democratic system. But it's hard to say because that works because they also have a parliamentary system. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. In the last 30 seconds, can you tell people how to get in touch with you to sign up to observe this audit?
Yeah, celectionaudit.org. Right up, and it's right up near the top of the homepage, celectionaudit.org. And in fact, you should sign up. Actually, the best time to sign up is in the half hour after the show.
Right.
The second best time is tomorrow.
Yeah,
and after that, you're probably just going to put it off. You got to do it by Friday or wait another year. We could use your help.
Yeah, and it's a great experience. So thank you, Luther. Everyone, it's a great experience. I highly recommend it. And next week, we'll be starting to have guests who are like nonprofits in the area because it is the season of giving, and we want to think about things other than politics and
Okay.
elections. So
Okay.
thank you, Luther, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thank you.